Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of CFA's Equity Conference 2024. Waves of Resistance, Merging Waters as Pathways to Justice and Healing. I'm really excited to be here with you all this morning. My name is Chris Cox, and I teach in the Department of Sociology and Interdisciplinary Social Sciences at San Jose State University. And I am a medium dark chocolate colored African-American male. I am wearing glasses. I am seated and really excited this morning to get started with our second day of the Equity Conference. We also have another CFA member who is here to co-host as well, and that is Kim Duran. And so I'll turn it over to you, Kim, to introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name's Kim Duran. I use he, him pronouns. I teach at Cal State East Bay. I'm describing myself. I am Hapa, meaning I'm biracial of European and Japanese descent. I have mostly gray hair, almost all gray hair. Wear black rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a beige and dark brown Aloha shirt today.
Great. So we're very excited here to start our session this morning with Colin Woodard. We are going to go through a couple of our meeting protocols this morning before we start. And so I will get us started with our land acknowledgement and our centering exercise. And then after that, we will have our interruption practice statement. And then Kim will introduce our guest speaker for today. And so we have a few practices that we like to use here in CFA as opening protocols for all of our meetings. And so I will begin this with reading the California Faculty Association Land Acknowledgement, which you should also be able to see in the webinar chat. We want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional land of the California Indian people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize the land as an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long history that has brought us to reside on the land of the California Indian people, and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. The California Indian people are very much part of today's California, living and working and caring for the land as they have always done. Acknowledging the land is an important indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. And I'm coming today from the lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people, here in San Jose, California. And so I'd like to take a moment for us to just do a collective kind of centering. And the purpose of doing this is so that we can actually get ourselves present and be focused for the tasks that are ahead of us. So if you can, just go ahead and take a moment to kind of relax in your chair or wherever you are. If you're standing, just kind of allow yourself to relax and maybe close your eyes or soften your gaze. We're going to start by taking a few deep breaths, and I want you to breathe deeply into your diaphragm, into the kind of lower part of your stomach, right? And start off by just taking in a nice deep breath. And then you can hold for a count of 3 to yourself. And then you can exhale and just release. Take in another deep breath. Just allow yourself to focus on the present moment. You can let go of anything from the past. You can let go of any other distractions and just be here in the present moment. Take in another nice deep breath. And this time you can also stretch yourself if you like. You can stretch your arms upward. Maybe roll your shoulders a bit. And just allow yourself to be comfortable in the space that you are so that you can be prepared to enjoy what is to come for the next hour and a half or so. And we also have the interruption practice statement. So Kim, I'll turn that over to you.
Will do. So CFA's interruption statement is, as part of our continuing commitment to racial justice work, when we experience examples of racial narratives, racism, or whiteness in our meetings, or as we conduct our business, we will address it. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention. We will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. Further, as we engage interruptions, we will take an intersectional approach, reflecting the fact that white supremacy and racism operate in tandem with interlocking systems of oppression, of colonialism, capitalism, class, heteropatriarchy, and ableism. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in the service of ending the system of racial oppression.
Great, thank you, Kim. And so now I think we'll have Laura will give us a little bit of logistic information before we get started.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining CFA's Equity Conference 2024. A few bits of helpful information for today. Please update your Zoom name to reflect your full name, pronouns, and campus. Closed captioning and American Sign Language services are being provided. To turn on closed captioning, you may activate closed captioning by clicking on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen, then click Show Subtitles to view captions. ASL interpreters will be spotlighted throughout the webinar. The chat and raise hand features will be disabled, but the Q&A feature will be enabled. Please note that this session will be recorded and posted at a later date to our CFA YouTube page and Council for Racial and Social Justice webpage. The audience interaction portion of equity sessions will not be recorded. Check out our Equity Conference landing page. All this information is posted into the chat, and for more helpful bits of information, click on the link. Please be advised, this session will be accompanied by a presentation that contains graphic material. Viewer discretion is advised. This session is also a part of our book giveaway. Click on the link in the chat and be one of the first 25 people to submit the form to get a free copy of Union: The Struggle to Forge the History of United States Nationhood. We will notify you by email if you are one of the lucky 25. If you are not one of the first 25 to submit this form, you will still receive a 10% off coupon for your book order with Reparations Club. Important note, there is only one free book giveaway per person throughout the entire conference, with the exception of We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For by Dr. Eddie Glaude, which will be sent to 175 participants courtesy of Eddie Glaude. Only those who are in the first 25 will be contacted.
Great, thank you, Laura. And Kim, whenever you're ready.
I was just going to pause for a minute. So I have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker for this workshop. The title of this workshop is The Making of Our Nation. The talk is about the history of now, North American regionalism, the sociology of United States nationhood, and how our colonial past shapes and explains the present. Our speaker today is Colin Woodard. He's a New York Times bestselling historian and Polk Award-winning journalist and a New York Times bestselling historian. He is one of the most respected authorities on North American regionalism, the sociology of United States nationhood, and how our colonial past shapes and explains the present. Colin offers a fascinating look at where America has come from, how we ended up as we are, which we are all dying to understand better, and how we might shape our future. He is the author of the award-winning Wall Street Journal bestseller, American Nations, A History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America, Woodard has also written a total of 6 books, including The Republic of Pirates, a New York Times bestselling history of Blackbeard's pirate gang that was made into a primetime NBC series, which I didn't realize even though I had seen it. And Union, the struggle to forge the story of United States nationhood, which tells the harrowing story of the creation of the American myth in the 19th century, a story that reverberates in the news cycle today. So I think we can turn it over to Colin. Is that okay, Chris? Are we ready to roll?
Very
Yeah.
good. Well, thank you, Kim, for that introduction, and also to the Faculty Association for having me, and the Council for Racial and Social Justice. It's a great pleasure to be joining you. I run Nationhood Lab, where I study and write about the problems of U.S. nationhood and how to solve for them. Nationhood Lab is based at Salve Regina University's Pell Center for International Relations and Public Policy, which is the legacy, along with the federal Pell Grant program, of the late U.S. Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island. And today, I want to share 2 things with you on the state of U.S. politics and society and the stability of our democracy here at the dawn of a frighteningly high-stakes election year, at a time when the United States' revolutionary experiment in democratic self-government remains imperiled to a degree not seen since the 1860s. First, an explanation for why the U.S., despite its myriad advantages, is, and for much of its existence has, been divided against itself, and thus vulnerable to collapse. Secondly, to draw attention to a key stratagem we're working at the Pell Center that can help hold us together against the forces of autocracy that threaten to bring down our republic and shatter the Union. I'll discuss more about that in a few minutes. But to really understand the situation today, I want to offer what I hope will be some helpful deep background information on the fundamental characteristics of the United States Federation, characteristics that make this country more structurally vulnerable than many of its liberal democratic peer states. First among these is the fact that the United States is not a nation state at all. We're a collection of stateless nations, each with their own intents, ideals, and story of national purpose. These regional cultures, which don't respect state or even international boundaries, have never been in agreement on the big questions. What is the proper role of government? The proper relationship between church and state, and even the meaning of such key words in the democratic lexicon as liberty or freedom. These stateless nations, these regional cultures, go back to the beginning of European conquest and settlement, to the 17th and early 18th centuries. The original clusters of colonies were settled by people from distinct regions of the British Isles, and from France and the Netherlands and Spain, each with their own religious, political, and ethnographic characteristics. Each was first colonized at a separate time and under a different political model. Some of these regional cultures, these nations, if you will, that you see here on the East Coast, championed individualism. Others, utopian social reform. Some valued equality and democratic participation in politics. Others, deference to an aristocratic order modeled on the slave states of classical antiquity. The Puritan project in New England had little in common with the neo-feudal aristocratic society of the Chesapeake country, or with the Dutch commercial colony encompassing what is now Greater New York City, or New Spain's far-flung northern frontier in what's now the United States Southwest, or the West Indies Slave Society planted in the deep southern lowlands by English planters from Barbados. For generations, these distinct and discrete Euro-American cultural projects developed in remarkable isolation from one another, consolidating their own cherished principles and fundamental values, and expanding across the eastern half of the continent in nearly exclusive settlement bands. They saw themselves as competitors for land, settlers, and capital, and even as enemies, taking opposing sides in the English Civil War of the 1640s, in the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89, in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and of course, the US Civil War. Here, by the way, is a map of Spanish colonization in the Southwest, the areas actually colonized prior to the US annexations. The point is that there's never been one America, but rather several Americas. And today, there are 11. To see their effect, you have to use county level data. So this is mapped at the county level resolution for analytical purposes. Now, there isn't time to describe them all to you here in this setting right now, but suffice to say that they've always been divided on key issues with profound effects for American history and society. Now, a quick word on what this map is representing and how it's created. These are settlement patterns. They're all based on that, much like the ones you saw on those previous slides. So to illustrate, taking one of these regional cultures at random, Yankeedom. So this colonial project started with the Winthrop fleet in the 1630s and the early Puritans arriving at Massachusetts Bay. And they were people who thought themselves to be in a covenanted relationship like the Old Testament Hebrews. God had chosen them to do a specific mission in the New England wilderness, and they as a group were going to go and do it, and they would be judged, punished, or rewarded by God, depending on how well they did. It was a communal and communitarian project, very different model than any of the other colonial projects. And this group came, they arrived in Massachusetts Bay, and they quickly ended up annexing and subsuming the old colony of the Pilgrims on Cape Cod and the royalist strange settlements, neo-feudal settlements that had been set up in Maine under Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And then they pulled New Hampshire and Connecticut into their orbit. And then when the Dutch, who had founded the New Netherland colony next door in what's now New York, when the Dutch were defeated in the 1670s, and New Netherland became New York, Massachusetts stood up and they said, hey, wait a minute, we have a claim to much of this province. And the claim was this, you remember at least when I'm a Gen Xer, and when I was in school, you'd get maps of the 13 colonies in your history book. Maybe it's still the case, and they look kind of like the 13 corresponding states today, except many of them had these strange appendages as wide as the colony that went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was like, Virginia all the way to the Pacific and South Carolina and so on. And Massachusetts had such a claim. They didn't know where the next ocean was, but like wherever it is, we claim a Massachusettsian wide strip all the way to the next ocean. And that strip encompassed much of upstate New York, the new colony. And so Massachusetts said, hey, this belongs to us. Well, the colony was named for the Duke of York, the king's brother, and it was his proprietary colony. So they lost that argument about sovereignty. But by way of compensation, they were given land title. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts was given land title to a massive strip of millions of acres of upstate New York, which Massachusetts settled with officially endorsed land companies, moving Massachusetts Yankee settlers with their Puritan project and mindset into vast parts of upstate New York, where they deployed New England-style villages and so on. They replicated the culture across that zone. Fast forward into the early Republic period, when the Northwest Territories were being created across the Appalachian Mountains, and the new Ohio Territory was created, and this process repeated itself because Connecticut said, hey, we have a Connecticut-wide claim to this. And that area you see on Lake Erie up there is the Western Reserve of Connecticut, which by way of compensation was given to the state of Connecticut, which settled it with their own land settlement projects. So that part of Ohio, and only that part of Ohio, was settled as sort of this larger Greater New England project. Same thing was repeated a generation later in the Michigan Territory, where the early lumberjack community and deployment of that moved from Maine to the uplands of Michigan, and most of the territorial government and early settlements, the territorial legislature, and then the conventions to write a new state constitution were all dominated by settlers from the Yankee upstate of New York, the Yankee settled Western Reserve Ohio, or New England itself, which supplied 5 of the first 6 territorial and state governors. Ditto as you move on into Wisconsin and much of Minnesota. So what I'm saying is that this occurrence, this drive, they were the ones who laid down the colonial settler culture's fundamental principles and norms. Ideas about what the good life is, how society should be organized, what institutions matter, the story of who we are, all this stuff that anthropologists define cultures by. And each one of these colonial projects had a different story and a different settlement band, which is what you see mapped here. So I just wanted to share that all with you here and you could tell a similar story for each one of these. Now, these various regional cultures you see here don't agree and never have agreed on a lot of things. For instance, how do you best create a society where humans can be maximally and sustainably free? Do you emphasize individual liberty, as the Scots-Irish inflected warrior culture of Greater Appalachia does, or the common good, as did the Puritans, with that covenant they in and a belief that they were in a communal project that they were going to be judged on the American frontier? Our politics, all the way up to 2016 anyway, had this as a central question, which is why you see this map at a county level reflected in so many others. For instance, election results. This is the 1916 presidential map, Woodrow Wilson versus Charles Hughes, when Republicans in red were the party of communitarian values and the Democrats in blue, the party of individual liberty for some and racial apartheid. Notice that the communitarian Yankeedom, New Netherland, and left coast aligned with the former, the individualistic Deep South, Greater Appalachia, and Far West with the latter. This, if we advance slides, please. So I'm going to advance twice. This is the 2008 map, Barack Obama versus John McCain. Pretty much the same as is the 2012 map and many other hotly contested maps in our history, except in this case, the colors have been reversed from 1916, because by this time the parties had reversed platforms, ideologies, and regional constituencies. And as you'll see, if you look closely, there's no longer this monochrome one-party rule in the Deep South and in the El Norte region, as I describe it, because Latinos and African Americans were able to exercise the franchise, which they weren't in 1916. These are effects that extend well beyond politics. For instance, how do you respond to a contagious, deadly airborne virus? You can see how individual liberty nations hobbled the US response to the COVID-19 pandemic, resisting mask wearing and vaccines, mapped here at Nationhood Lab by the regional cultures or nations as of August 15th, 2021, a time when vaccines have been freely available for many weeks. Some of the communitarian nations on this map, you'll notice, had almost double the per capita vaccination levels as the Deep South. And these, at a county level, are the per capita COVID-19 deaths for the summer of 2020, before vaccines existed, from the New York Times. You unfortunately see these regional divides in the prevalence of various diseases. Here's diabetes prevalence per capita from CDC data as processed by my team and our academic collaborators at the universities of Minnesota and Illinois, Chicago. The Deep South and Greater Appalachia have a specific problem here. This is life expectancy in years. As our project revealed in a Politico story I wrote last year, we found 3 to 5 year differences between the larger of these regions, a gap comparable to that separating the United States from Bulgaria, Libya, and the Philippines. And the gaps didn't go away when we parsed by race, urbanity, impoverishment, education, or access to quality healthcare. Little appreciated is how much the incidence of gun violence, like so many other salient issues in American life, varies by region. Here, again using CDC data, we mapped the per capita rate for gun deaths by county between 2010 and 2020 inclusive. The Deep South's annual per capita rate of 15.6 per 100,000 residents is about double that of Yankeedom, that greater New England region that I described to you earlier, and about 4 times that of New Netherland, the Dutch legacy zone around greater New York City, whose rate of 3.8 per 100,000 isn't much higher than Switzerland's. The gaps, by the way, persist or grow wider if you look at just urban counties or just rural counties or just homicide or just suicide or just white victims or just Black victims. This was a subject of another Politico story I wrote that was their most read story on their site of 2023. When I've shown this image on the internet, by the way, the thread typically fills up with vulgar sometimes comments that amount to, oh, this is just a map of where Black people live. because African-American gun homicide rates are typically a decimal place higher than for whites, although the suicide rates are about half the white rate. But to dispel the notion that regional effects and cultural effects are not actually at play, here's the same exercise repeated, but only for white gun deaths. You can see that here the Deep South's rate is more than double that of Yankeedom and 5 times that of New Netherland. Not unrelated, here's every fatal white supremacist mob action in the United States between 1835 and 1964, both lynchings and riots, as mapped by the Monroe Work Today Research Group. The orange dots each represent an incident where an African American was killed. The yellow dots are Latino victims. The existence of these regional cultures also profoundly affected the patterns of 19th century immigration. This, also from the Census Bureau, is the percentage of foreign-born people in 1900 by county. The darker the shading is, the higher the percentage. The darkest shades are 30% or are larger of the population, if you can't see the key, and the ones that are completely white have no foreign-born population or under 1%. And you can see, as you look on this map, that nobody came to the Deep South, Tidewater, and Greater Appalachia, further reinforcing identity and demographic differences between the regional cultures. And this affected the distribution of religious traditions. Here, from the Association of Statisticians of American Religious Bodies, U.S. Religion Census, are the dominant religions in each county today. Red is Baptist. There's a green Methodist belt you can see pouring through in the Midlands. Gray is Mormon, and blue is Catholic, the largest religious group amid that giant 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that so profoundly changed ideas about American identity, forcing legacy Protestant America to accept that henceforth Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Jews, at least, would be full-fledged Americans too, except none of that happened in these southern regions. That Baptist zone you see on this map is the legacy of the spatial maldistribution of that big immigration wave, the only part of the country where Christian nationalism, the notion that America is rightly an evangelical Protestant nation, can find fertile soil, because it's so obviously not the case in the other regions and hasn't been for more than a century. Here is a detailed crowdsourced map of American dialects today by the researcher Rick Ashman. And like many of these data sets, this appeared years after I wrote American Nations. He basically asked on the internet, you could essentially connect and leave a sound file of you saying a certain script. And then they, as linguists, would look at diphthongs and stuff and sort it by linguistic group. So today, notice that the major domains in blue follow to a great extent the American nation's regional culture lines, which makes sense when you think about it. And to my surprise, it affected even genetics. American Nations is all about cultural transmission, not genetics. But this study, which came out in 2017, 6 years after American Nations, in the journal Nature Communications, had scientists from Ancestry.com, you give them the swab and they tell you your genetic profile. They also, if you check the box saying that you can use it for research, they ran into giant computers and the computers just looked for unlikely interrelated clusters. And because they also have your genealogy posted, because they're Ancestry, they know where your parents and your grandparents and so on were born and died and where they lived, so they could map it backwards. And these, they didn't know anything about American Nations, but you can see to an incredible extent, even that big decision of who do you partner with and have children with had a strong regional pattern, with the Greater Appalachian settlement stream, which started in southwestern Pennsylvania, splitting on the two sides of the Appalachian Ridge, which kind of makes sense when you think about that. So my point is that the divides are real, they're persistent, and they affect life today. So that brings us to the second question. What holds us together? What's ever held us together? Because the regional cultures, those 6 Eastern ones anyway, wound up together in an accident of history. They came together in 1776 to face off a common threat, a change in British imperial policy that threatened to destroy the relative autonomy of each of their individual political and social systems. To stave off this threat, they formed a joint military command in the form of the Continental Army, a treaty organization. the Continental Congress, which had to move around the map as the battle lines shifted. And miraculously, they won. And they found themselves in something called the United States. But nobody was really sure what that was. The United States came into being as a contractual agreement, a means to an end for the parties involved. Nobody had thought that they had just created a nation state in the sense that Holland or Prussia or post-revolutionary France were. Its people lacked a shared history, religion, or ethnicity. They didn't speak a unique language all their own. They hadn't occupied the continent long enough to have some sense of dwelling in a mythic homeland since time immemorial, and they'd killed or pushed off or were actively pushing out the people who had such a claim. They lacked a shared political heritage, apart from the imperial ties they had just revolted against. And they had no shared story of who they were and what their purpose was. In short, they had none of the foundations of a nation state. They had no story to bring and hold them together. That story had to be created decades later, starting in the 1830s, really, a story I tell in my most recent book, Union. It's the one thing that's held us together, more or less, ever since, but it's been contested from the outset. Today, the regional fissures are having a corrosive effect on that story. That story is a shared loyalty to the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence, the inherent equality of humans, their rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and representative self-government. And when those ideals are under assault, the United States has little to fall back on to hold it together. And this is a very important point. The fate of the Republic and the fate of the Federation are one and the same. If the Republic falls, the Union will inevitably collapse thereafter. Such stories, such national narratives, are required for every nation, be it Germany or Hungary or Japan or ourselves. Because as individuals, to have fealty to something as abstract as a nation, to feel that we owe it greater loyalty than to others, that we're bound to its fellow members more than to those who are not members, that we might ultimately give our lives for it. That requires a compelling and credible story, an idea that's evocative and feels true on some level, that has footings in the past and gives us an answer for why we're together. A society without a credible story, the historian William McNeill wrote 35 years ago, soon finds itself in deep trouble, for in the absence of believable myths, coherent public action becomes very difficult to improvise or sustain. And so the story of United States nationhood, of what the country's purpose was, of who belonged, of where it came from and where it's going, had to be created ex post facto. And by the time we really got around to doing it in the 1830s and 1840s, there were already two stories competing with one another, two stories of America that could not coexist, a contest over identity and purpose that has continued to this day. One story said, yes, we may lack a shared history, religion, or ethnicity, but what we share is a set of ideals, the ones I mentioned from that famous passage in the opening statement in our opening statement as a people, the Declaration. To be an American is to be committed to this set of propositions about the nature of the universe. In this tradition, first packaged and promoted by a Massachusetts Yankee, the historian statesman George Bancroft in the 1830s, Bancroft, by the way, wasn't just pontificating, he was an active participant in politics and in manifest destiny, and as a secretary of the Navy in the Polk administration, it's he who created the Naval Academy at Annapolis and who gave the orders to the Pacific Squadron to seize and occupy California's coastal cities in 1846, triggering its annexation. But Bancroft had earlier argued that America's purpose was to create a society dedicated to making the Declaration's ideas and ideals a reality, and that Americans' purpose is to fight for those ideals and for one another being able to secure them. Now, those ideals are good ideals. Think about it. A natural right granted to all humans by God or the universe, or as the Declaration puts it, nature's God, to not be tyrannized, to survive, to pursue our happiness as we each understand it, and have equal access to the representative self-government that makes that all possible, and that we're in a covenant as Americans to protect one another's rights and access to these things. These are the ideals that Frederick Douglass fought for in every speech he gave. This is Lincoln at Gettysburg and MLK at the Mall. It's our civic national ideal, the American promise. But it was contested almost immediately from when it was first produced in the 1830s. Sorry, we're getting a multiple movement. There we go. By a counter-narrative crafted by a circle of Southern intellectuals who said, no, the Declaration is wrong. Humans are not equal. Only the Anglo-Saxon race, they argued, had the genius and ability to secure the promises in the Declaration. We're a classical republic, like ancient Greece and Rome, where a minority have the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery are the natural lot of the many. It was ethno-national and inherently an authoritarian vision. The battle between these two visions of America has been our eternal struggle. This was the fight throughout the antebellum period, in the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Southern redemption, as they called it. The ethno-nationalists actually ruled this country in the 1910s and 1920s, when the first deep Southern president, Woodrow Wilson, segregated the federal government, when they were putting up the Confederate statues that we're now taking down, when Birth of a Nation was all the rage, a film that created Hollywood literally and celebrated the KKK's successful terrorist campaign to restore white supremacy in the occupied South. This is the actual movie poster that they had promoting it. It was no secret. And when the 1924 Immigration Act imposed racial quotas to explicitly defend the alleged Anglo-Saxon character of the country. The civic national vision only triumphed federation-wide in the 1960s, the result of the mass mobilizations in the world wars, the civil rights movements those returning African American and Native American and Latino vets helped spearhead, and the interventions of the federal government at key moments, because the existence of a formal racial apartheid regime in the American South was providing the Soviets with powerful propaganda to win the hearts and minds of people in the primary battlefield of the Cold War, what we now call the Global South, but was then called the Third World. And so the civil rights movement toppled Southern apartheid and challenged Northern racism. The feminist movement demanded social, professional, and sexual equality for a gender that comprised the majority of the population. Gays and lesbians fought the police and discriminatory ordinances. Elite colleges began partially dismantling their old boy networks, and public universities rapidly expanded to increase educational opportunities, spearheaded by yours in California. Congress passed a new immigration law in 1964 that repealed the ethno-national quotas, reopening America's gates to humanity at large. A new generation of historians challenged the neo-Confederate narrative of American history that had dominated scholastic textbooks for half a century, while dispelling the innocence of the American colonization of the continent. And so the civic national narrative returned to the fore. And that is when we became a liberal democracy in living memory in the 1960s, not the 1860s. And the fact is, a liberal democracy is not inevitable. It's an incredible gift that had to be fought for and continues to need to be fought for, because the forces of autocracy and ethno-nationalism are on the march, and they have their narrative all worked out, their story of the kind of country they're fighting for. Make America great again, like it was before the civic national triumph. We don't have our story worked out. We, the 70 or 80% of Americans who, if they really stopped and thought about it, don't want to live in that authoritarian world. We've lost our story, our message. We were never great about talking about what these civic ideals mean in practice, but we stopped trying after the Cold War, and a vacuum opened up, and demagogues stepped right in. We need that story now. Not only because democracy really is better than dictatorship, but also because the consolidation of an ethno-national authoritarian regime would almost certainly trigger the physical collapse of this federation as well. That's the work that we're doing right now at Nationhood Lab, the testing, polling, and crafting of an emotive, weaponized, if you will, American story, the answer to the belongings and togetherness questions and where we might be going. one that can be used in ordinary conversations in real-world situations, one that can rally that latent supermajority to defend what should have been America's values for all of these past 248 years. We'll be perfecting that story, a story of pride and reckoning, of an effort to create a society where all people can be meaningfully free. And we'll be helping deploy it by putting it in the hands of organizations working to reform civic education, to engage Hollywood producers and television showrunners to bring these themes into their creative mix, to help business leaders grapple with what values their institutions really can't do without, to political leaders, Republicans, Democrats, independents, or whatever, so long as they share a commitment to the American experiment, to organizations working to field and protect the vote, like the 700 chapters of the League of Women Voters, to the 250th anniversary commissions in each of the 50 states tasked with helping commemorate the anniversary of the country and the Declaration itself, and in the hands of all of you. Now, you might say you'll never convince everyone. True, there's 10 or 20% of Americans who really are all in for ethno-national authoritarianism, who genuinely relish the public promises of their leader to assign active duty military forces to domestic law enforcement duties, to pardon convicted insurrectionists and other criminals en masse, a class that will likely include himself, to investigate and jail critics and political rivals on trumped-up charges, to purge the civil service and stack it with people whose loyalty is to him, not the people, country, or law, to use the Insurrection Act to crush protesters, a world where reporters, public officials, election workers, and anyone the leader regards as vermin are physically threatened or attacked at his behest, a world where elections will no longer be settled by voters, but by the machinations of the regime. The 10 or 20% who genuinely support this agenda will reject the narrative I propose because they reject the American experiment. It's also true that many more won't want to listen or hear, committed to their tribal identity, the safety and comfort of an information bubble, or the love of the leader. But some will. And to protect democracy in the next few years in a country poised on a knife's edge, a shifting of 5 or 6 or 7% of those asleep at the wheel, unaware of the stakes and the threat, would be decisive. And in the middle and long term, I believe that we have the wind at our backs, the backs of an omnipartisan, anti-authoritarian majority, because I have Gen Z and Gen Alpha children, and their generations and the millennials are not on board as a group for authoritarian ethno-nationalism. And as their electoral power grows in the coming decade, that threat to our country will recede, and we can finally move on to addressing the core problems that got us there in the first place. So I invite you to follow our work as it continues to unfold at nationhoodlab.org, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. That was wonderful. There's just so much, so many different questions to ask. Kim, do you want to get started with questions?
Sure. Actually, a colleague of mine had to drop off. They were intent, but they were hoping you could talk a little bit more about Native American or indigenous folks, because you didn't really, obviously you're talking about these regional cultures, but how does that overlay with the original inhabitants of all of this, what we're calling America, and how does that reflect in terms of the cultures potentially in some of the different regions too?
Absolutely. Yeah. And, this is the story of the, colonial settler projects and what they wrought, because they are the dominant force that shaped our history. That's not to say that's good, but just that that's what's happened. So it's important to understand it. Yeah. So if you looked at the expanded map upwards, you'll see that there is an entire zone of our continent where indigenous people were never, in effect, removed from control of a whole zone. I call it First Nation the map, but it's across a lot of northern Canada, Greenland, parts of Alaska, where essentially the colonial project thought, there's just ice up there. We're not going to even bother to steal this land because there's nothing up there. Of course, there's all kinds of stuff up there, not only the valuable cultural resources, but rare earths and water and oil and who knows what else up there. And those regions are places where the Indigenous people have won in Canadian constitutional courts and in the relationship between a nearly independent and currently autonomous Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and in Alaska, less so than the other two places, a degree of sovereignty that's approaching that of being, autonomous nationhood. And that's coming back to the fore. So there are parts of the continent where, in fact, the colonial project didn't reach, and that Indigenous people are still operating on their own terms in an environment that they've occupied all of that time. But in the other places, yeah, absolutely, right? Where we gave our acknowledgement you gave for California. I'm here in Wabanaki land. The surviving Wabanaki nations here in Maine, the Penobscots and Passamaquoddy, are trying to reviving their stance, tangling with the state right now for all of that legacy. And the relationship between these regional cultures and the Indigenous people they encountered from the beginning shaped the trajectory of history, and it shaped even these dominant regional cultures. I mean, one thing I will say is that the stance of each of these colonial projects towards the Indigenous people they were encountering was very different. Under Samuel Champlain, the New France experiment, throughout what's big chunks of maritime Canada, Quebec, and later had an enclave in southern Louisiana after the English annexations and an ethnic cleansing campaign. But the French position was essentially that the tribal leaders of the bands they encountered were the equivalent of vassal nobles. And if they would, agree to, give homage to Louis XIV, they would each be treated as princes and allied princes in their allied armies, just like you might have done on the continent of Europe. And so they saw them as equals in a sense, and also didn't have a strict racial line, like you are savages and we are civilized. There was intermarrying. There was Métis people in large numbers very quickly, including some of the leading figures in the French colonial project. Baron von Castine, one of the senior officials in all of Acadie, which was the whole southern zone of the New France Empire in Northeast North America. Shortly after he arrived, he married the Penobscot chief's daughter and moved half the year in the Penobscot's main winter settlement and had children who were bicultural and bilingual, who then in their generation became the leaders of the French colonial project there, being fully ambidextrous between the cultures. That kind of stuff did not happen at high levels in New England, where they saw the Indigenous people increasingly as aligned with Satan, and they were aligned with God, and led to ethnic wars and conflicts, an impermeable membrane between the two groups. And in the New Spain project in the Southwest, by the time this is the far-flung northern borderlands for Spain's territorial project, south to north, and by the time they reached there, right, almost everybody in the early settlements were mestizo. They were part Indigenous anyway, and so any kind of racial hierarchy had already broken down as a practical matter. So the argument was people of reason versus people who are not yet civilized, and that we, people of reason, we consider the Indigenous people to be equally human, but they lack this wonderful civilization of ours. So we will take them, maybe even force them to be on missionary complexes and convert them. But the idea wasn't that you're inherently inferior, but that your culture is and you need to take on ours. Not a great thing, but, marginally better than the English one. And so those also have totally different outcomes and also different ideas about, who is us and who belongs that come out of those experiences. But I don't want to use up the entire question. We could talk for 2 hours on the Indigenous landscape. But yes, it matters a lot, and it affected even the dominant cultures that I'm describing in the American nations model.
And to kind of follow up on the same vein, thinking about that in terms of African peoples that were brought into the various nations. And so I know when you look at, for example, on the map and you see the area around New York, that's the New Amsterdam, kind of dynamic that you talk about as a region, and having a little bit more of a kind of a, I don't know if the word that you used is like a multicultural, kind of a form of multiculturalism that occurred in that particular place. That was then very different from not very far away, which would be the Chesapeake Bay area. Is there any, insight that you maybe have in terms of the, that relationship between colonizers or settlers coming and being an indigenous space, and then also the introduction of African peoples in those various regions, and then maybe the different mindsets about how they should be treated or regarded, and how maybe they were seen as similar to, different from native people that were here, with the last point that you made regarding, they're human, but they just don't have that level of civilization. What was kind of a different, what might have been different when it comes to the relation with Africans at that time in those regions?
Another terrific question. We could speak for hours and bring in lots of people who study specifically that. But yes, there were strong differences. So, as I think probably everyone knows, that in the 17th century, slavery existed in some form everywhere in all the colonies and in many places in the world. The big differences were that the Deep South started already as a fully formed chain gang slave society built on, a calculation of the value of sugar and human lives. And that system had already been perfected on the island of Barbados, right? They worked out this whole horrible system and then expanded when they ran out of land to the new colony of Carolina in the West Indies, it was called, and coming to Charleston, transplanted a Caribbean slave state right into the subtropical lowlands that spread into kind of what we call the Cotton South or the Lower South over the subsequent centuries. So that there's a society where slavery is literally the core concept of the entire society, and an oligarchy, and society is meant to serve the people at the top, slavery and everything else included. So that's like the really extreme example. You go northward, the Chesapeake country, it started like there would be, there were slaves. There were also indentured servants. There were people of African descent and people of European descent who were both indentured servants, who appear in the 17th century to finish their indentures and have, be able to go out equally successfully, claim their lands and do things for a time. But you start moving into about 1700 in the Chesapeake country. And the model in the Chesapeake was set up not by Puritans, it was set up by the lesser sons of English gentry families, of the Lord Granthams of their day. In England, the firstborn son would inherit the manor and everything, and the second and third and fourth and fifth born sons get nothing. And some of them came to the new opportunities in the Chesapeake to try to create their own manorial estates. In other words, they were trying to replicate the neo-feudal society of the English countryside they'd left behind. They considered themselves to be enlightened gentlemen, but they needed serfs to be the hands. And so indentured servants were supposed to be that. By 1700, it was clear that wasn't working. And then they turned to the example that they'd seen form and from the 1670s onward in the Deep South. They're like, oh, let's try this, right? So what I'm saying is it's shifting over time there. You go further north and, the Dutch zone, so that the Dutch were all about tolerance. And it is multicultural. Many people can be here. The Dutch were often a minority in the colony, and even in what became New York City for a long time. There were people of many ethnicities and creeds and religions, and indigenous people and Swedish people and Muslims, all there from the time it was a tiny village. It was already kind of New York when there were only 700 people there. But tolerance is kind of value neutral, right? This is a commercial colony. There wasn't a lot of democracy then. It was run by a big corporation, the Dutch West India Company, and they were tolerant of difference, of strangers be here, of slaves, of later abolitionists, of slave catchers, like anything goes, and it was all about money. So the slave system there was a lot of room for negotiation, because if you could come up with a nifty contract, like you were an enslaved person, you go to your master and haggle them like, well, what if I leased myself out? I give you this payment, I can go out. There were people who are half free, and it's despotic, but the room for maneuver for enslaved people was much greater than it was further to the south. And then you get up to Yankeedom, New England, and the Puritan dominant culture got all worried about, is this moral or not? Well, we have slaves. Is there a way you can be a moral slaveholder, right? An impossible task, but they were like, worked out, how can we figure out rules where we can be moral people and hold slaves? And for a long time, they kind of tried to do that, but it seemed to be something that was itching at their consciousness. And so it became, in New England, became some of the places that earliest on actually ended up abolishing slavery locally. So, the experience of being enslaved in these different regional cultures for African people would be different, and the possibilities of becoming free or possibly approaching equality in the early 18th century was larger in some places than others. So I mean, that would be the quick synopsis. So regional cultures mattered, but one might say, well, shouldn't there be a African-American regional nation, right? But the point is, these are the colonial settler projects that dominated things, and if you want, tyrannized in different places. And one of the great tragedies is, of course, they weren't to allow that in the places where African Americans might have been numerically large enough to be a dominant regional culture, although, of course, the effects on the United States and all these regional cultures are profound. But the people at the top calling the shots were often not reflecting what many of the people below them would have wanted to do.
Should I ask another question, Chris, or are we going to open it up at some point to our audience?
Folks in the audience can go ahead and use the Q&A feature. So if you go down to the bottom of your screen, you can click on that and you can actually type in a question there. So Kim, if you have another question, why don't you go for that? And then we can also start taking more questions from the audience.
Well, I have at least 5, but I think I'll start with in the chat. In the chat function, they talked about an article that you did in Political using some research that kind of took the regions and kind of applied it to life expectancy. You also did gun violence, you did loan. There's so many great topics that I would love to explore, but maybe pick one of those. The life expectancy is in the chat, so maybe you could talk a little bit about that one.
Yeah, so I mentioned it briefly in the talk, the top line stuff, 3 to 5 year population level differences between the regional cultures. And that gap didn't go away when we sliced and diced it by any metrics that the CDC data let us slice and dice by. Some of the top line things were, for instance, we would compare, say, just rural counties to each other, or just urban counties to each other, or just the richest counties in the entire country that happen to be in each regional culture. The top quintile of the 3,200 US counties, the top quintile, we then looked at all the ones collectively that happen to be in the Deep South and all the ones that say we're in Yankeedom. And what we found, we did bottom quintile too, we found that in aggregate, the very richest US counties that happen to be in the Deep South have a lower life expectancy than the bottom quintile of US counties that happen to be in Yankeedom. That's the level of disparities in regional cultures. We also, gaps persisted when the county health rankings project, which is run out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They use federal data, but they polish and process all the data so that you can see county level comparisons and rankings for different health metrics. And one of them they do is they have like 9 or 10 factors to assign a value for quality of healthcare available in each county. So we took the very best, right? And the very best counties and the very worst counties and compared them across regions. And same thing, the gaps did not end up going away. So what that showed us is there is something at work. It's not the hospitals are bad or good at where you live, or that your county is rich or poor, that makes the gaps go away or not. Health conditions are worse in the poorer counties, but if you compare poor on poor counties between the regional cultures, there's still this gap, right? Education, same thing. So what I'm saying is there's a fundamental thing. What is it? Remember, I touched on that individual liberty versus common good thinking. And what that comes down to when it comes to government are opposite things. If you think that freedom is about maximizing individual autonomy and reducing the power of government because government is the only tyrant out there, then your solution is to give government no power. Don't have taxes, right? Because taxes are stealing from you. Don't invest in things because that's reducing your freedom and building up a tyrannical, government. If you're in a communitarian society and the idea is we have to be free, we have to maintain all the things that allow us to keep reproducing a Republican citizenry. So you do need to invest in public education and in healthcare and in roads and all the leveling mechanisms that make it possible for everybody to participate in the experiment. They're 2 totally different philosophies. And if you take them to healthcare, which is a classic individual liberty, common good issue, that's where a lot of the ties and correlations are. We want to dig deeper into that. And then some of the peer-reviewed research I've been doing with my public health, academic co-authors, we've been looking at a lot of things that are pointing towards the places where the culture does not want to invest in these shared public goods have bad health outcomes and life expectancy and gun violence rates and more disabled people and more sleep disturbances, and diabetes is higher, obesity is higher, inactivity is higher. All of these things keep overlaying with the same geography, which matches attitudes about how best to have a free society and how you do or don't spend public resources. So, politics begets public and policy investments, creates the social determinants of health, and results in health outcomes appears to be the chain that we're creating the evidentiary chain linkages with in our peer-reviewed work that we're doing.
Mhm.
And so I have a question that's coming from the audience. That's also a question that I had written down. And it is about the demographics and some level of demographic shift. And so, many of us here in California, we're aware that there are Californians leaving. I live in the Bay Area, which is very expensive. And so there are people who constantly talk about things like, well, I'm going to save my money and I'm going to Texas, or I'm going to Utah, or I'm going to another region, basically another nation, as you describe the various nations in your work. And so the question is, what dynamics do you see currently and in the future in terms of these regions mixing and the regional culture becoming less salient, maybe shifting with demographic changes, immigration, mass media, and then also social media?
Yeah, excellent question, and exactly the question one should ask. I mean, maybe it makes sense that in the colonial area, in the early republic, and an early settlement of the West, that these regional cultures would matter. But come on, right? We have mass media and mass retailing and the internet, and people travel around, and half the population is born in one place and moves to another, and you have immigration from other places. Surely that's making us all more purple, or taking away the fundamental characteristics and their salience. That would make sense, but you look at any empirical data and the differences between these regions are growing, whether it's politics or healthcare or whatever it is. So why is that? Well, broadly at the abstract theoretical level, the American nations model would say, look, here's how basically human society and assimilation works, whether you're in Japan or the United States or Iceland or wherever you are, is when somebody comes and moves to a place, either from another region of the country or from Mars or wherever, when they arrive there, they're still going to be Martian, for instance, and they're still going to have a hard time totally assimilating into France or Iceland or wherever they are. Maybe they speak with an accent, and maybe it's, people know that they just look like they're a Martian, and it's all strange. But generation 2, right, is going to have grown up there and has facility with the language, maybe bilingual and bicultural, and but it has those things. Maybe they still have a torn identity, but by generation 3 in general, the idea that you're a Martian American or a Martian Icelander is more abstract, right? You probably don't, maybe you understand the language, or maybe you don't, but you've lived and grown up in this other environment. Over 3 generations, generally, if there's not a policy obstacle to stop people assimilate into the culture around them over that generational sphere. So theoretically, if lots of people move from place to place, yeah, they're going to change the place in the short term. But the theoretical argument is the dominant cultures win out, whether they're France or Yankeedom or Japan or whatever it is. They kind of have this inertia that, of course, they change and adapt at the margins, but at the core, it changes you rather than you change them is the dynamic at work, in theory, right? So when people move around, one thing that reinforcing that in the United States context is the migration of people. A lot of social scientists have looked at, my gosh, people are moving from blue states in the north to red states in the south. Why are the red states getting more red? Shouldn't they be getting more purple? And the answer is, as they've studied everyone who moves based on driver's licenses and then gone and found them and asked them questions, basically the answer is when the people who are moving in aggregate in terms of values have more in common with their point of destination than their point of origin. In other words, they're voting with their feet. We are self-sorting in what Bill Bishop called the big sort, where we're all moving. If we have an opportunity to move and we have any say in the matter, we tend to move to places where our people who think like we do are, and to get away from the place of your birth, right? Where in your perspective, there's all these, assumptions that no one examines. Completely wrong. People around me drives me crazy. They think X and Y, and clearly A and B are true. And if my company ever let me move, I would move to somewhere where people think A and B, and they do. And so that's actually reinforcing the differences between the regions instead of shifting them. Many of the, in aggregate, the people moving north to south tend to be conservatives moving to a conservative place more than the other way around. And so that's a countervailing force that helps explain how it can be that empirically we're seeing the differences growing, not going away. And as I've described in a lot of the different issue sets, you can see the fundamental characteristic differences going all the way back to early colonial settlement. You can sense it in the differences between the regional cultures on various issues and metrics.
So to follow up with that, and thanks for that, do you have any information or insight in how that affected patterns for Black folks moving in the Great Migration from the South to the West, which is what my family did, folks moving to the North? And you mentioned earlier talking about some of those kind of regional differences. I'm just wondering if there are, within, for example, African-American communities, are there ways in which some of those regional differences manifest in tandem with the moving of people, largely for cultural and economic reasons, looking for work, going to other regions of the country for opportunities that did not exist, especially in the rural South? Maybe if you have any insight about those patterns.
Yeah. Or being refugees from terror campaigns at different times in history as well. Yeah, I've had exactly the same question and talked to people about it. I would love to be able to dig into that. What I know is that people from certain parts of the southern regions moved to specific places. Like there's pathways, right? If you were in the lower Mississippi Valley, you went up the Mississippi to Chicago or maybe Detroit. If you were on the eastern seaboard in the Carolinas, your path was going up through Washington and Baltimore and eventually New York and Boston, right? So there's linkages that go in those directions. What I don't know and would like to know is, are there, as anthropologists would say, survivals in the culture that are different? Like, are there deep Southern aspects that came to Chicago in the African-American community that are different from New York via the Carolinas? I don't know. Maybe not, because the assimilation of the regions affects everybody. Maybe so. It'd be a fascinating question to delve more into, and there may be scholars who are working on it. I would love to collaborate and link up with whoever is doing it, but it's been on my mind. And out west is a really interesting one as well. Do you end up in the, I don't think people were picking based on the regional cultural zones the same way that immigrants during the 1880 to 1924 wave were coming, because it was fuzzy. The West was still being settled even in the early 20th century. In some ways, you could say the interior West is still being settled, initially colonized in a first settler Wilbur Zielinski cultural geography sense. So, the intel as to, if you go to this place versus that place, that you'll be in a different region wasn't quite as clear, but the effects of ending up in those places, the cultural environment and possibilities are very different in different zones. There's a whole, you probably saw, I can't remember the names of the researchers, but there's a white paper, at least, I think it's actually out of one of the Federal Reserve research arms, but which is tracking the Confederate diaspora. In other words, whites right after the Civil War leaving the Confederate states and moving west, and where they went and didn't go, and then matching that to the laws that were creating essentially a Jim Crow system in parts of the Southwest, but not in others, institutionalizing Southern norms in Arizona and elsewhere. I haven't tracked and followed that down, but I think absolutely there's going to be differences based not only where you arrive, but who else was transmigrating at the same time. And yeah, that would all be fascinating. I haven't done the work myself, but I'd love to add it to my list with collaborators who know their stuff.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that many African Americans, in terms of that tracking from Louisiana and Texas, came to California, whether it's Los Angeles or the Bay Area. Chris and I are from California, so I think we've seen those patterns, and a lot of it was around World War II, so it was a little bit later than the Great Migration to the Midwest and to the East Coast, and it was from a different part of the South, if you will, and where they went to. So, but again, familial networks, I'm sure social networks, those are all super impactful, because people also go where they know people. There's somebody else who's quote unquote settled before them. They were not the colonizers, but they were colonized, but they were people going to connect up, and also for economics. I think it's really important to deal with, for certain people, their migration patterns are heavily driven by the need for, a job, like you said, from the rural South to places where they can make and be treated better,
And the West, of course, that when you get to the 20th century migrations, particularly second half, the story in jobs and economics gets all mixed with the federal government's deployment of military bases and military industry. I mean, it starts shaping the same way, I argue the interior West, the area that's marked as far west on my maps. It's not in the Spanish settlement zone and isn't in the left coast area, which was colonized by Yankees and overland by essentially greater Appalachian people from the lower Midwest, and created this weird hybrid culture. The rest of it, from the 100th meridian over through a lot of the Intermountain area, that's the one area where I say environment trumped ethnography. In essence, none of the legacy colonial projects could survive the arid West and its difficulties, how far it was from markets, the crops didn't grow, the social systems broke down. And so it followed the deployment of industrial scale capital that made it possible to be there. Railroads, metal smelters, all the rest, which either the federal government or the Hearst Corporation or Union Pacific Railroad or Anaconda Copper provided and deployed, right? And then you fast forward, and then in the post-war period, it's like military bases and nuclear refining and all those. It's almost like the Union Pacific was setting up its own towns to serve its railroads and then moving settlers. Sometimes they would actually advertise the Union Pacific and other railways in Europe, and you get immigrants to come buy a through ticket. They would be brought by steamship, put on the rails, and brought to the new town they were trying to create. It's like a directed settlement project. But in a sense, the federal government played many of those roles in the mid 20th century with the deployment of all that infrastructure from Manhattan Project through to mobilizing for World War II and the Cold War.
Yeah, and the pattern that Kim just described definitely describes part of my family, a side of my family coming from Texas and Louisiana to California and via military. And now what we're seeing also is that there are patterns of Black people, of African Americans moving back to the South in many cases as well, right? For a variety of reasons, cost of living, economics, having housing, intergenerational wealth transfer, et cetera. But I did want to ask this question. It relates a little bit to what we learned in another session yesterday, having to do with artificial intelligence and algorithms and such. And so a point was made that looking for, this was a faculty member of ours who was looking, in one place for information on Egypt during the time of the Arab Spring. And so when they were on campus, they did a general search for Egypt, and they found lots of information coming up about the conflict, about the politics of Egypt, et cetera. Then they were in another location, another physical location where likely the use of internet was by a totally different demographic group. And so when they looked for Egypt, what they found was simply travel agencies. None of the news stories came up, nothing else came up. The reason I'm asking this is I'm wondering if there is some sort of similar effect that maybe you've come across in some of the research based on these different nations. Is there even a different access to information? Is there a different flow of information? I know that if I watch YouTube and if I click on an exercise video, the next time I come into YouTube, I get a whole bunch more exercise videos in my feed. Right. I just don't know if maybe this is something. And part of the reason I'm asking this is I want to know, how much do you think the information that we have access to influences how we fit into those regional cultures, those various nations? And then I guess that would lead me to ask, like, what kind of hope do we have for then breaking cycles of misinformation, breaking cycles of conspiracy like QAnon, et cetera, if where we live helps to determine what kind of information we have access to in the first place? So if you have any insight about that, I'd love to hear.
Those are all excellent questions. I hadn't thought about, to the extent that algorithms are serving us our feed and our public information and who we converse with and what we see, are there differences between the regions in aggregate? Probably there are, and that would be a really interesting thing to research. I think to really do it, you'd have to have the cooperation of some of the tech giants that have the data. I don't know if their incentives are aligned with showing that or not, but what I have thought about a lot is, for everyone in the world, the fact that the public square is becoming divorced from geography, cultural transmission is about, within your culture is transmitted within your family and your schools and your neighborhood and your community and the town hall and your grandparents and, your church, and all of those things is how humans have always transmitted culture over generations until now. And suddenly the threat to cultural survival, transmission of values everywhere in the world, created by the fact that everyone is getting their stuff from an algorithmically determined feed, and that one can buy that feed to use it to sell you widgets or Pepsi, or for a foreign state to have you go out and rent-a-mob to attack another rent-a-mob they've created in your town, which has happened, right? That totally changes the game. And people have been thinking about this for a while. I mean, 15 years ago, when a lot of the researchers were worried that, young kids in the Arab world out there were getting radicalized by ISIS or other extremist groups because they were being served on the internet, films and a steady propaganda diet about Islam that was totally divorced from their own parents and community and place of worship, and that was actually happening. So I mean, that 15 years ago, when it wasn't even really social media yet, it was just like sending videos around, that was already something that had popped up as a concern about cultural transmission. And now it's everywhere, right? It's it's hyper extreme. Can you transmit the values of wherever you are, if that's not where kids are getting their information, or adults for that matter? So yeah, that's a challenge, not just for the American nations model, but for everywhere. Yeah, one of the many harrowing things that we have to deal with as humans is trying to get a handle on all of that. And you throw AI into the mix, and I don't know, right? That's you just have to take what you can and keep moving forward and try to figure out how these things are going to evolve. But yeah, those are serious challenges to, cultural integrity everywhere, political integrity. Here, like the cultural integrity of the idea that the United States is somehow or should be devoted to, liberal democratic norms in the Declaration, that's been all messed up by the creation of QAnon and other theories. What is truth? Truth doesn't exist. It's sort of the model that Russian disinformation had forever, before there was even an internet, that if you send out enough propaganda that nothing is knowable and therefore anything's possible, that people give up. You can't have a democracy if there aren't facts, right? Then it all becomes conspiracy and mythos, and you kind of have to give up, because what are you going to do? That would be the danger, is that we all end up like that. So anyway, tech isn't my area of expertise, but I know that a lot of our future is going to be determined by how we as a societies handle all of those things. So I hope those who are specializing in that part of the challenges to our country and the world are working on that successfully.
Yeah, I hope so. And it's just an area of fascination for me, because especially as you talk about the ways in which we have these kind of regional nations, and it challenges our ability to have a level of solidarity, right? And then the questions are, what do we do about it? What do we do to actually try to, either facilitate greater communication, or to, as you talked about, create that message that people can kind of cling to, which I think is also really challenging, right? Because as you mentioned, there are some messages that are easier to craft, right? And on the side of the right politically, drill baby drill, is very easy. No new taxes is very easy. You can put a lot of things into 3-word statements, but trying to unify, basically 11 different kind of nations within is not going to work with a 3-word statement.
Yeah, it's easier to break stuff than to make stuff. It's a challenge. But it is, as you point out, I mean, QAnon and MAGA and Trumpism and its messaging have shown a proof of concept, right? Tens of millions of Americans have been moved politically into a space they really weren't in before, I would say radicalized successfully through messaging in the internet. So in theory, although there may be slightly more challenging, it should be possible to pull the other way, which is why having this message I described, figuring out how do you really talk in ordinary circumstances about these lofty values that can hold our country together in a kind of the best promise of the United States, the best version of ourselves. How do you really talk about that? That's the work we're polling and testing right now. You know, our vendors are actually busy at it. And by June, we should be able to share that with everybody in the world, but also with our partners, because, you know, someone out there who does know how to, you know, the arts of the necromancy of the internet and knows how to manipulate all of these things, needs some good messaging to be using if the other side is going to be doing that already. So I don't think it's the best battlefield out there, but I know you can't just cede the entire space, or bad things will happen. So.
Absolutely. So just to jump on that a little bit in the few minutes we have left, are there any patterns that you've seen with the various nations that also overlay, you know, in the article on Politico, you talk about how a lot of those, that pattern of nations overlays with things like healthcare. What have you found when it comes to education? Are there some very specific, maybe, you know, regional differences in those various nations that relate to education, public education, or education systems in general? I know that when we look at the demographic information, obviously there are different rates of things like graduation with a bachelor's degree in different areas. You know, different states have different rates and things like that. But I wonder if there's maybe any research that you have about the overlay of educational attainment, educational access on that map. Yeah,
that's an excellent one. We haven't literally run the numbers yet, although that's on our agenda to get to on, you know, like per capita, you need county level data, and then you'll look at like per capita investment in public education and, you know, reading scores, and you can do all that stuff. Pretty sure what it will show is very stark regional differences of the type we described, despite the existence of federal grants and the fact that states govern a lot of policies. You know, and many of these regional cultures, states are divided between different regions, but I think you'd still see it within states. Why is that? You know, the difference in attitudes towards education between these regional cultures was absolutely enormous, right? In New England, for theological reasons, they needed everyone to know how to read so they could directly access the Bible for their own sort of purposes. So on the frontier in the 1600s, you know, the first thing they would do is basically set up a taxpayer financed public school with compulsory, you know, attendance, you know, free, and off you go. And it created what was probably in the late 1600s, the most literate society on the planet with the highest literacy rates. And because they had that, right, incredibly high literacy for the time period, that meant there were people who could read, which meant there was a market for creating a printing press and having a newspaper, or having a book, or having a library, and then producing colleges and schools, and then higher education levels. And so they ended up dominating all the way until, you know, the second half of the 19th century. New England completely dominated like intellectual discourse, publishing, the transmission, the media, basically. They had the entire media wrapped up, and their narrative in history books, in speeches, and everything else of the country was, you know, Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, and that the entire country comes from there, which of course was total nonsense, right? The Puritans were wonderful, tolerant people who cared about religious freedom. No, they cared about their religious freedom, right? But there are all kinds of stuff built into that narrative that went back to the Mayflower story. But it was a dominant narrative. Like, people in the other regions didn't like it. They knew it was false, but they didn't have the means to win the media war because, you know, the New Englanders were like a giant conglomerate that controlled all that stuff. All the way through until after Reconstruction, there essentially were no public schools of any kind in the Deep South, right? Nobody was, if you didn't have the money to hire a tutor or to send your kid to, Phillips Andover Exeter up in New England, or to Eton, or, you know, the Dragon School back in England, or have a tutor in your house, then tough luck. You don't get any education. So, you know, among whites, the education levels were staggeringly low, and literacy was staggeringly low in those regions. So like two completely different planets in education, all the way through Reconstruction. And in Reconstruction, one of the many things that essentially the Yankee occupation of the Confederacy, they were trying to remake the Confederate states in their own image. So one of the key things that was deployed during the occupation were schools. Taxpayer financed public schools, not segregated, with New England school teachers usually, and they became among the prime targets of the KKK to stop the Yankees from educating people, black or white. So yeah, educate. So that has a long tail. Right now, there is public education everywhere in the country, but all of that legacy is still with us. And, Jim Crow era, and then when the federal government, when the Supreme Court said you have to have integrated schools, in the South, they set up their segregation academies, right? Christian schools that were essentially so they could escape the public education system. So then if you're already going there, then you want vouchers so your taxpayer money can finance your segregated school, and you don't care about financing for the other people, right? In the public schools, which didn't happen in places that didn't have that same patterning. So yeah, there's all kinds of reasons why, when we get around to crunching the data, why it's probably going to show what I'm predicting it will probably show. And that affects all sorts of things, right? You look at like William Gilmore Simms in Union, is the guy who like creates the ethno-national white supremacist narrative for the Confederacy and for the antebellum South. He was a leading man of letters, and he was a novelist, and was compared to Edgar Allan Poe, and was considered a great in his time and all that. Super respected intellectual who was arguing for a sort of deep Southern and then Confederate identity. He was frustrated and publicly frustrated throughout his career of setting up journals and newspapers and trying to do this cultural production that he couldn't make any of it survive in his native region, right? There weren't enough subscribers, there weren't enough readers, there weren't publishing, houses. Nobody appreciated it. He had to do all his publishing out of New York and travel up there because, to his own frustration, despite being a rabid nationalist for his region, none of this was possible, even though he was trying to do it. So yeah, it was a profoundly shaping force.
Great. I could listen to you all day long. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We are at close to the end of our time. We did get another statement in the chat for someone saying, I found this presentation fascinating. We also had someone asking, maybe this would be something we can do in the future, asking a little bit more about self-directed learning and intellectual pursuits in those regions where maybe the public education tradition isn't strong, et cetera. I do want to, before we finish today, I want to remind folks, please look in the chat again, and you can, if you have not done so already, fill out the form so that you can be one of the folks to possibly get a free book, as well as if you don't get the free book, you can get the 10% discount on the book. We would love for that, for you all to be able to do that. And Kim, do you have any final thoughts or words or anything you'd like to share?
Well, just much thanks and gratitude, Colin, for sharing your information. People definitely go check out the web page that Colin mentioned, because I think I was looking through that, and there's a lot of rich wealth of information. And I don't know if Laura can put that in the chat, the actual link to where Colin works. Yeah, very good. Thank you, Colin. Nationhood Lab. It really is a lab. It's an online lab, but it's rich with data and information and provocative questions.